They mocked the human translator. Then her voice made a HiveMind collapse. Before the alien report ends, share if you believe humanity is the outlier that breaks the system. Enjoy the story. The silence in the war room was deafening. Across the vast metallic chamber of the Alliance flagship, Concordia representatives from 47 species sat in perfect geometric formation. Crystalline Vexari flickered with anxiety. Towering Croth generals clicked their mandibles in frustration. The air itself seemed heavy with the weight of impending defeat. For 3 years, the Galactic Alliance had thrown everything at HiveMind Omega. Plasma cannons that could crack moons had been absorbed and turned back upon their creators. Quantum bombs that bent reality itself had been redirected with surgical precision. Future tech beyond imagination, adaptive AI networks that could rewrite themselves, consciousness-disrupting frequencies capable of shattering minds, reality-warping devices that existed at the very edge of possibility, all had failed against the collective intelligence that controlled 14 billion synchronized minds each one, a perfect extension of an incomprehensible whole. And now, as their final desperate strategy session began, humanity had sent her. Elara Quinn stepped through the airlock, her footsteps impossibly small against the titanium floor. 26 years old, orphaned since childhood, carrying nothing but a worn headset around her neck and a leather-bound book that looked ancient, even by human standards. She wore no armor, bore no weapons, displayed no rank insignia, just simple civilian clothes and eyes that seemed to hold depths no one had bothered to explore. "This is what Earth sends us." General Thaxton's voice resonated through his translation matrix, each word dripping with contempt. A translator. To the final strategy meeting of the greatest war in galactic history. Murmurs rippled through the assembly. The Zephyrian delegates' bioluminescent patches pulsed with what could only be described as embarrassment. Embarrassment for humanity itself. Elara found the only empty seat tucked away in the corner where the observer species were relegated. She opened her Dictionary of the Dead, a compilation of extinct languages she'd spent her life studying, and began to write. Not words as the others assumed, but something else entirely. Patterns, rhythms, the spaces between thoughts. Colonel Monroe, the grizzled human military attaché, leaned over to the Croth general. "She's not what you think she is." "She's exactly what I think she is," Thaxton replied. "A waste of oxygen in a room where warriors plan for victory or death." What none of them knew was that Elara wasn't recording their strategies. She was listening to their silence. In the pauses between their arguments, in the rhythms of their breathing, in the forgotten frequencies that existed in the spaces between words, she was hearing something that would change everything. The briefing commenced, with holographic displays showing the devastation. Entire star systems reduced to synchronized biomatter. Civilizations that had stood for millennia now existing as extensions of a single, terrible will. "The hive mind operates through perfect unity," announced Admiral Kresh, his 4 eyes scanning the assembled delegates. "No individual thought, no personal desires, no fear of death because death to them is merely data transfer. Our psychological warfare is useless. Our divide-and-conquer tactics mean nothing to a species that thinks as one." Species after species presented their failure reports. The Vaxari had tried quantum entanglement disruption absorbed and redirected back at their fleets. The hegemony had attempted consciousness viruses the hive mind had evolved immunity within nanoseconds. Even the Void Walkers had found their reality-bending abilities turned against them. "What about biological weapons?" suggested the Terran delegate, a thick-necked general named Harrison. "Tried," Admiral Kresh replied curtly. "They adapt faster than we can deploy. They've taken our survival skills and amplified them 1,000-fold through collective learning." Throughout this litany of failures, Elara continued writing. Her pen moved in strange patterns, sometimes following the rhythm of whoever was speaking, sometimes creating entirely new cadences that seemed to pulse with life. General Thaxton noticed her movements and snorted. Perhaps our human observer has insights to share as your translator discovered the secret to defeating an enemy that has no language. The room fell silent. 47 pairs of eyes, or their equivalent, turned toward the small human in the corner. Elara looked up from her book, and for a moment, something flickered in her expression. Not fear, not defiance, but a kind of deep sadness that seemed older than her years. "They do have a language," she said quietly. "We're just not listening to it." Laughter rippled through the assembly. Not cruel laughter, but the kind reserved for the obviously delusional. "The hive mind communicates through direct neural transfer," Thaxton explained, as if speaking to a child. "Pure data exchange. No words, no syntax, no linguistic structure. That's basic xenobiology." Elara nodded slowly. "I know, but that's not what I'm talking about." She stood, walked to the central holographic display, and touched a control. The image shifted, showing the most recent battle footage. Thousands of Omega drones moved in perfect synchronization, their actions flowing like water, like music, like poetry, Elara whispered. "They're speaking in movement, in rhythm, in the spaces between actions." The room was dead silent now. "You want to know why every strategy has failed?" Elara continued, her voice growing stronger. "Because you're trying to fight a symphony with shouts. You're trying to disrupt harmony with chaos, but chaos isn't the opposite of order, silence is." General Thaxton's mandibles clicked in agitation. "This is precisely why humans don't belong in strategic planning. Romantic nonsense when we need military solutions." But Admiral Kresh was staring at the display with new eyes. "Show me," he said to Elara. "Show me what you see." The next morning, as the Alliance fleet prepared for what many believed would be their final offensive, Elara found herself increasingly isolated. Where other delegates gathered in strategic clusters sharing intelligence and coordinating attacks, she sat alone in the observation deck surrounded by her strange books and obsolete recording equipment. "Dead languages," muttered Commander Vex as he passed her table. "Of all the resources humanity could contribute, they send us someone who studies dead languages." His companion, a hegemony tactical officer, glanced at Elara's work. "What is she even doing? Those aren't battle plans." They weren't. While every other species analyzed combat data and weapon specifications, Elara was mapping something else entirely. On her screens were frequency analyses, rhythm patterns, and what appeared to be musical notation. Her survival skills, honed through years of decoding extinct civilizations, had taught her to find meaning in the seemingly meaningless. The future tech surrounding her quantum processors, neural interface arrays, consciousness mapping devices, all sat unused. Instead, she worked with simpler tools, acoustic analyzers, pattern recognition software, and her own uncanny ability to hear languages that had been silent for millennia. Colonel Monroe approached during the third day of preparation. "They're not wrong to doubt you," he said, not unkindly. "Your file says you've never been in combat, never even left Earth's academic institutions until 6 months ago." Elara didn't look up from her work. "They're not wrong about that. Then why did you volunteer for this?" She paused, her stylus hovering over a particularly complex waveform pattern. "Because someone needs to listen to what the hive mind is actually saying." "And what is it saying?" For the first time in days, Elara smiled. It wasn't a happy expression. "It's screaming. Has been for 3 years. We just don't recognize the sound." Monroe frowned. "Screaming, what?" "That's what I'm trying to figure out." Around them, the preparations continued. The Alliance had assembled the most sophisticated war machine in galactic history. Ships that could bend space itself, weapons that operated on principles that defied physics, strategic minds that had won countless conflicts across the stars. And yet, as Elara watched the organized chaos of military preparation, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were all missing something fundamental. Something that couldn't be solved with bigger guns or better future tech. That evening, as the fleet moved into position for the final assault, General Thaxton made his rounds through the command decks. When he reached Elara's station, he paused, looking at her scattered papers with obvious disdain. Still playing with your dead words, while real warriors prepare for battle. Elara looked up at him. Really? Looked at him for the first time. Thaxon was impressive. Even by Kroth standards, 3 meters tall, chitin armor that could deflect plasma bursts, mandibles that could crush steel. A warrior bred for combat, trained for victory, hardened by 1,000 battles. "General," she said quietly, "what scares you most about dying?" The question caught him off guard. "Excuse me? In your culture, when someone dies, what's the worst part?" "The pain, the separation from loved ones. The unknown of what comes after." Thaxon's mandibles clicked in confusion. "I don't understand the relevance." "The HiveMind doesn't understand it either," Elara interrupted. "That's the point. They can copy our tactics, adapt to our weapons, predict our strategies. But they can't comprehend something they've never experienced." Which is..." Elara turned back to her work, her voice so soft Thaxon had to lean down to hear her. "Being alone?" The assault began at 0600 Galactic Standard Time. Across 17 light-years of space, the Alliance fleet engaged HiveMind Omega in what would be recorded as the largest battle in known history. Ships the size of cities traded fire with biomechanical constructs that defied description. Reality itself seemed to bend under the weight of weapons that existed at the very edge of possibility. Elara watched from the command center of the Concordia, her fingers dancing across her instruments. While tactical displays showed the ebb and flow of battle, her equipment tracked something else entirely, the rhythm of combat itself. "Wave 7 incoming," announced Admiral Kresh. "Omega is deploying their adaptive shielding. All vessels switch to Pattern 7 attack sequence." The order rippled through the fleet. Thousands of ships adjusted their firing patterns, their movements, their very approach to combat. It was a dance they had perfected through 3 years of war, fluid, responsive, deadly, and utterly predictable. On Elara's displays, the HiveMind's response patterns were becoming clear, not just their tactical adaptations but the underlying rhythm that drove them. Like a massive organism breathing, like a heart beating like music, she whispered. "What was that?" Colonel Monroe, stationed beside her, leaned closer. "They're not just adapting to our tactics." Elara said, her excitement growing. "They're improvising on them, like jazz musicians responding to each other's solos, but across 14 billion minds simultaneously." As if to prove her point, the HiveMind's counterattack began. Their bioships moved with impossible coordination, not just responding to Alliance maneuvers, but anticipating them, building on them, creating variations that turned the Alliance's own strategies into weapons against them. "All fleet commanders, this is Admiral Kresh. The enemy has compromised our communication arrays. They're inside our tactical networks." Panic rippled through the command center. If the HiveMind could access their communication systems, they could predict every move counter, every strategy, turn the Alliance's own coordination against them. But Elara was already moving. "Sir, I need to send a signal through the compromised network." General Thaxon, monitoring from his station, spun around. "Absolutely not. The last thing we need is for them to access whatever primitive human systems you're using." "They already have access," Elara replied, her fingers flying over her controls. "But they don't understand what they're hearing." Before anyone could stop her, she activated her transmission. Not words, not data, not any kind of strategic communication. Instead, she sent a simple acoustic pattern, something that sounded almost like music, but not quite. Like a song remembered from a dream or a melody played on instruments that didn't exist. The effect was immediate and unexpected. Across the battlefield, HiveMind Omega forces suddenly hesitated. Their perfect coordination faltered for exactly 3.7 seconds. In space combat, that might as well have been an eternity. The Alliance fleet, trained to exploit any advantage, pressed forward. For the first time in 3 years, they weren't just holding their own, they were advancing. "How?" Admiral Kresh demanded. Elara was staring at her readouts with a mixture of excitement and terror. I sent them something they've never encountered before, something their collective consciousness can't process or adapt to because it doesn't operate on logic or tactics or any kind of system they understand. What loneliness, she said simply. I sent them the sound of being alone. The tactical situation continued to evolve. The HiveMind, for all their adaptive capabilities, seemed unable to counter this new element that had been introduced into their perfect symphony of war. Their attacks became less coordinated, their responses more individual. But Elara wasn't celebrating. Her survival skills, developed through years of studying dying civilizations, told her this was only the beginning. The HiveMind wasn't retreating, they were learning. And when they figured out how to process what she had sent them. "Sir," she said urgently, "I need to make direct contact, not through our compromised systems, not through weapons or future tech, direct, personal contact." The command center fell silent except for the distant sounds of battle. "That's suicide," General Thaxton said flatly. Elara nodded. "Probably, but it's also the only chance we have." The HiveMind synchronization chamber was unlike anything in the Alliance's experience. It existed in the dead space between systems, a biomechanical construct the size of a small moon, pulsing with the combined thoughts of 14 billion minds. To approach it was to court madness. To enter it was considered impossible for any individual consciousness. Elara's shuttle, little more than a life support pod with basic propulsion, drifted toward the construct like a mote of dust approaching a star. Inside, she had shed every piece of technology except her ancient headset and the Dictionary of the Dead. No weapons, no armor, no communication devices that could be compromised or adapted by the HiveMind. "Last chance to reconsider," Colonel Monroe's voice crackled through the fading communication link. "We can extract you for another 12 minutes before you enter their field of influence." "No," Elara replied, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to attempt. "This is the only way." She had spent the past 24 hours preparing not with military briefings or tactical analyses, but with something far more dangerous: memory. Using techniques she had developed while studying extinct civilizations, she had unlocked every buried trauma, every suppressed fear, every moment of absolute solitude that had shaped her into who she was. The memory of 6-year-old Elara hiding in the ruins of her family's home, while HiveMind scouts converted her mother into one of their drones. The feeling of being utterly, completely alone in a universe that had suddenly become incomprehensibly hostile. The sound of her own heartbeat echoing in empty halls, while everyone she had ever loved marched away with vacant eyes and synchronized steps. As her shuttle penetrated the outer membrane of the construct, reality began to shift. The HiveMind's influence washed over her like a tide, seeking to subsume her individual consciousness into their collective perfection. She felt their presence pressing against her thoughts, probing, analyzing, attempting to understand this anomaly that had entered their domain. Not necessary came the voice that was 14 billion voices speaking as one. Regeneration is cleaner. Integration is optimal. Resistance is irrelevant. Instead of fighting, Elara did something that had never been attempted in the 3-year war. She opened her mind completely, removing every mental barrier, every psychological defense, every survival skill that might protect her from their influence. The HiveMind rushed in, expecting to find another consciousness to assimilate another mind to add to their perfect collective. Instead, they found something they had never encountered: the raw, unfiltered experience of being utterly alone. Not just alone in space, but alone in existence. The devastating isolation of consciousness, trapped within a single skull, forever separated from every other being by the impermeable barrier of individual experience. The knowledge that no matter how close you become to another person, you can never truly share your thoughts, never truly merge your experiences, never escape the fundamental solitude that defines conscious existence. It was everything the HiveMind had been created to eliminate, and it was magnificent. "What is this?" The collective voice was no longer unified. Cracks were appearing in their perfect harmony. Instead of answering with words, Elara began to sing. The song was older than human civilization, a funeral dirge that predated written language. She had found it carved into stone tablets in the ruins of a dead world, a lament for the final member of a species that had faced extinction alone. The melody was haunting, not because of its complexity, but because of its profound simplicity, a single voice carrying all the weight of individual experience, all the beauty and terror of being utterly, completely yourself in a universe that cared nothing for your singular existence. Each note synchronized with the HiveMind's own neural rhythms, but instead of harmony, it created dissonance. Beautiful, terrible dissonance that spoke of experiences they could never share, thoughts they could never truly understand, emotions that existed only in the space between one mind and another. The unbridgeable gap that made each consciousness precious, precisely because it was unreachable. Stop, they pleaded, their voice fracturing into millions of individual components for the first time in their existence. This is pain. Elara whispered, tears streaming down her face. This is what it feels like to be human, to carry joy and sorrow that belongs to you alone, to love someone knowing you can never truly become them. To face death as an individual, not as part of a collective, with all the fear and hope and desperate humanity that entails. The song continued, and with each note, the HiveMind experienced something they had never been designed to process, the irreducible singularity of conscious experience. They felt for the first time what it meant to be one instead of many, to face the universe from behind the walls of a single mind, to carry thoughts and dreams and fears that could never be fully shared or understood by another. It was terrifying. It was beautiful. It was absolutely, fundamentally human. And they couldn't bear it. When Elara emerged from the synchronization chamber 6 hours later, she was changed. Not physically, she bore no marks, no injuries, no visible signs of the ordeal she had endured. But her eyes carried a weight that hadn't been there before, the look of someone who had stared into the absolute heart of alien consciousness and somehow returned to tell the tale. The Alliance fleet hung in space around the HiveMind construct weapons trained on the massive biomechanical entity, waiting for orders that wouldn't come. Because across 14 billion minds, perfect silence had fallen. Every HiveMind drone, every bioship, every synchronized warrior had simply stopped. They didn't power down, didn't collapse, didn't retreat. They just stood motionless, their weapons dropping from suddenly slack grips, their perfect coordination dissolved into 14 billion individual moments of stunned recognition. "Status report," Admiral Kresh demanded as Elara's shuttle docked with the Concordia. "They're experiencing individual consciousness for the first time," Elara said, her voice hoarse from singing. "Every single one of them is suddenly, terrifyingly alone in their own minds. They don't know how to process it." General Thaxon, monitoring from his command station, clicked his mandibles in disbelief. "You mean they're thinking independently? More than that, they're feeling independently. For beings who have never experienced solitude, the sensation is overwhelming. They're discovering what it means to have private thoughts, personal fears, individual hopes and dreams that can't be shared through their neural network." Colonel Monroe studied the tactical displays where 14 billion red dots had gone from synchronized movement to complete stillness. "Are they suffering?" Elara considered the question carefully. "They're learning what it means to be mortal, to face the universe as individuals rather than as part of a collective. That's not suffering, that's consciousness. But it's consciousness they were never designed to handle." Through the command center's viewing ports, they could see the HiveMind construct itself beginning to change. The perfect biomechanical surfaces were developing irregularities patterns that spoke of individual expression rather than collective design. Some sections pulsed with different rhythms, others had gone completely dark, as if entire segments of the collective were choosing silence over the overwhelming noise of shared existence. "What did you show them?" asked Admiral Kresh. "I didn't show them anything," Elara replied. "I let them experience what it feels like to be utterly alone. Not just physically separated, but existentially isolated, to have thoughts and feelings that belong only to you, that can never be perfectly transmitted to another mind." She walked to the central display where the biomechanical construct dominated the view screen. Their entire civilization was built on the premise that separation is weakness, that individual consciousness is a flaw to be overcome. But they discovered something in those 6 hours that they never expected, which was that being alone isn't empty. It's not a void to be filled or a problem to be solved. Loneliness, individual consciousness, the irreducible singularity of personal experience, it's where beauty comes from. It's where art comes from. It's where love comes from, because you can only truly love someone if you are separate enough from them to choose that love freely. The tactical officer monitoring HiveMind communications suddenly looked up from his console. "Sir, we're receiving transmissions from the construct. Not unified signals, thousands of individual voices." Admiral Kresh frowned. "What are they saying?" "They're asking questions. Personal questions. What does it feel like to be afraid? How do you make choices when no one else can share your thoughts? What is the purpose of dreams that only one mind can experience?" General Thaxton's massive form shifted uncomfortably. "And what are we supposed to tell them?" For the first time since her return, Elara smiled not with sadness or exhaustion, but with something approaching hope. "We tell them what we told ourselves when we first learned to be human, that being alone is terrifying and wonderful, that individual consciousness is the greatest burden and the greatest gift in the universe, that survival skills aren't just about staying alive, they're about learning to live with the magnificent isolation of being yourself." As if responding to her words, the biomechanical construct began to fragment, not violently, not in collapse or destruction, but in a kind of controlled division that spoke of choice rather than chaos. Sections broke away to drift in space, each one now pulsing with its own unique rhythm, its own individual pattern of existence. "My God," Colonel Monroe whispered, "they're choosing to be separate." Elara nodded. "They're choosing to be themselves." The aftermath was unlike anything in recorded galactic history. Where once there had been HiveMind Omega, a unified threat that had dominated 3 years of brutal warfare, now there existed something entirely new. 14 billion individuals, each struggling to understand the concept of personal identity for the first time. The Alliance fleet found itself in the strangest position imaginable, no longer at war, but serving as counselors to their former enemies. Ships designed for combat were now providing psychological support to beings experiencing the fundamental shock of individual consciousness. "The fragmenting is accelerating," reported Dr. Yelan, the expedition's xenopsychologist. "Each day, more of them are choosing to disconnect from the collective neural network entirely. They're becoming, well, there's no other word for it. They're becoming people." Elara spent her days in what had once been interrogation chambers, now converted into something resembling therapy sessions. Across from her sat beings who had never needed names, who had never experienced doubt, who had never faced the terrible freedom of making choices that no one else could make for them. "I don't understand," said the entity that had once been Omega Prime 7743, now calling itself simply 7. Its biomechanical form had begun developing individual characteristics, asymmetrical patterns that spoke of personal preference rather than optimized design. "When I was part of the collective, every action had purpose. Every thought contributed to the greater efficiency. Now I think thoughts that serve no function." "What do you call this? Imagination?" Elara replied gently. "Curiosity. The luxury of having mental space that belongs only to you." Seven's optical sensors flickered a new behavior pattern that seemed to express confusion. "But what is the purpose? If thoughts serve no collective function, why do they exist?" "Because they're yours," Elara said. In a universe of infinite beings and infinite possibilities, those thoughts are the only ones exactly like that, in exactly that combination experienced by exactly that consciousness that makes them precious beyond measure. These conversations were taking place across the fleet as Alliance personnel who had been trained for war found themselves conducting philosophy seminars with beings who were learning what it meant to have souls. The future tech that had been designed to defeat the hive mind was now being repurposed to help them. Consciousness mapping devices became meditation aids. Neural interface arrays became tools for exploring individual identity. Quantum processors became systems for processing the overwhelming complexity of personal choice. But the most remarkable transformation was happening to the biomechanical construct itself. As more individuals chose to disconnect from the collective network, the massive structure was literally reshaping itself. Instead of the perfect geometric patterns of hive efficiency, organic irregularities were appearing sections that curved for no tactical reason, chambers that served no collective function, spaces that existed simply because some individual mind had imagined them beautiful. "It's becoming art," Colonel Monroe observed during one of their regular briefings. "The entire construct is turning into a kind of sculpture created by 14 billion individual aesthetic choices." General Thaxton, who had spent weeks struggling to understand this new reality, clicked his mandibles thoughtfully. "I owe you an apology, human. When you first arrived, I saw weakness. I saw irrelevance. I didn't understand that what I was looking at was a weapon more powerful than anything we had imagined." Elara shook her head. "I'm not a weapon general. None of us are. That's the point." Then what are you—" She considered the question, looking out at the transformed construct where millions of former HiveMind entities were learning to be themselves. "We're proof that consciousness doesn't have to be optimized to be valuable, that efficiency isn't the highest goal, that the most powerful force in the universe isn't unity, it's the courage to stand alone and still choose to love, to create, to hope." The data streams from the former HiveMind entities were unlike anything in xenobiological history. Where once there had been perfect coordination, now there was chaos, beautiful, creative, gloriously inefficient chaos. Former drones were creating art that served no tactical purpose. Ex-commanders were writing poetry that contributed nothing to military efficiency. Entire sectors of the construct had been converted into gardens that existed purely because someone had imagined how beautiful flowers might look in zero gravity. It was by every tactical measure a complete breakdown of military order, and it was the most magnificent thing any of them had ever witnessed. "Sir," the communications officer announced, "we're receiving a transmission from the central consciousness. It's different from the others." Admiral Kresh nodded. "Put it through." The voice that emerged from the speakers was unlike any they had heard from the former hive mind. It was singular, but not isolated, individual, but not alone, as if it had learned to be itself, while carrying the echo of what it had once been. "We understand now," it said, "why you fought so hard to remain separate. Not because separation is strength, but because separation is the only way to truly choose connection. When unity is forced, it is not unity at all, it is merely shared imprisonment. But when individuals choose to come together, to love, to cooperate, to create something greater than themselves, while remaining themselves, that is power beyond anything we had imagined." The voice paused, and in that pause they could hear something that had never existed in hive-mind communications before emotion. "We have a request. We wish to join your alliance, not as the HiveMind Omega, but as 14 billion individuals who have learned the value of choosing to stand together. We offer not our collective efficiency, but our individual gifts, our personal perspectives, our survival skills developed through the beautiful struggle of learning to be ourselves." In the silence that followed, Elara felt tears on her cheeks, not of sadness, but of something approaching wonder. "Admiral," she said quietly, "I recommend we say yes." 1 year later, the Alliance capital on Kepler 442b had changed in ways that architectural historians would study for centuries. Where once there had been stark corridors designed for maximum efficiency, organic curves now flowed like frozen music. The integration of former HiveMind entities, now simply called the individuals, had brought aesthetic sensibilities that no single species could have imagined. In the center of the diplomatic quarter stood a structure that defied traditional sculpture. It was neither monument nor building, but something entirely new, a crystalline growth that seemed to pulse with inner light, its surfaces covered with patterns that told the story of consciousness choosing itself over conformity. At its heart, barely visible unless you knew where to look, was a simple relief carving of a young woman speaking into empty space. No nameplate, no explanation, no text of any kind. Just the image of Elara Quinn. At the moment, she taught the universe a new kind of language. Children from 47 species played in the gardens around the memorial, their laughter mixing with the harmonious hums of former HiveMind entities who were still learning what it meant to experience joy as individuals. To some of these children were biological offspring, others were adopted across species lines, and still others were former drones who had chosen to experience childhood for the first time in their existence. The future tech that had once been designed for war now powered playgrounds where young minds from across the galaxy learned that difference was not division, that individual consciousness was something to be celebrated rather than feared, that the universe was vast enough for infinite perspectives to coexist in harmony. Elara herself had requested no formal recognition, no military honors, no titles or ranks. She had returned to her work as a linguist, but with a difference now: she studied living languages, the new forms of communication that emerged when beings who had never learned to be individuals began to express their unique perspectives for the first time. "You did something that will echo through eternity," Colonel Monroe told her during one of his regular visits to her research facility on Earth. "You ended a war without firing a shot. You turned enemies into allies by teaching them to be themselves." Elara looked up from her current project, a comprehensive dictionary of individual expression that was growing by thousands of entries each day. "I didn't end the war, Colonel. I just helped everyone remember what they were fighting for, which was the right to be beautifully, gloriously, irreducibly yourself, especially when that self is afraid, alone, and imperfect." Through her office window, they could see the spaceport where Alliance vessels arrived daily with new delegations of individuals, each one eager to share their unique perspective, their personal insights, their survival skills developed through the struggle of individual consciousness. Some had become artists creating works that could only emerge from minds that had learned to think in solitude. Others had become philosophers exploring questions that could only be asked by beings who had experienced both unity and separation. Still, others had become teachers, passing on lessons they had learned about the courage required to be genuinely yourself in a universe that often demanded conformity. "There's something I never told you," Elara said, her fingers tracing patterns on her desk that resembled the neural rhythms she had first detected in the HiveMind's communications. "When I was in that synchronization chamber, when I was teaching them what it felt like to be alone, I wasn't just showing them human experience, I was learning from theirs." Monroe frowned. "Learning what? That we're not as different as we thought. Every conscious being, whether human or alien or artificial or something we haven't dreamed of, yet faces the same fundamental choice: conform or be yourself. Submit to the collective or find the courage to stand alone. We had just learned to make that choice earlier than they did." She stood walking to the window where the mixed crowds of Alliance species and individuals moved through the spaceport with an easy familiarity that would have been impossible before the war. "The HiveMind was never really our enemy," she continued. "Fear was our enemy. The fear that we're too small, too weak, too alone to matter in a universe full of powers greater than ourselves. But that's exactly backwards. It's because we're small and weak and alone that we matter. It's because each consciousness is irreducibly unique that each consciousness is infinitely valuable." In the distance, a group of individual children beings who had never experienced childhood as a collective were learning to play games that required cooperation between separate minds. Their laughter carried on the wind, a sound that represented something new in the galaxy joy that was both individual and shared, personal and universal. "The memorial inscription," Monroe said suddenly. "What would you want it to say if you had to choose?" Elara considered this, watching the children play while their various parents, biological, adoptive, and chosen family from dozens of species looked on with the universal expression of beings who had learned to love individuals rather than categories. "You carry no weapon," she said finally, quoting the words that had appeared in Alliance strategic manuals in the months following the war. "You are the weapon, but not the kind that destroys. The kind that creates, the kind that teaches enemies to become friends by teaching them to be themselves." As the sun set over the Alliance capital, the memorial sculpture caught the fading light and threw it back in patterns that no one had designed, but everyone recognized the visual representation of consciousness celebrating its own magnificent, terrifying, absolutely essential solitude. And in that light you could almost hear the echo of an ancient human lament, transformed by alien voices into something new, a song of individual consciousness that had taught the universe what it meant to be brave enough, to be alone, and wise enough to choose connection anyway. These were the HFY stories that would be told for generations, not tales of human superiority, but chronicles of the moment when consciousness itself learned to celebrate the beautiful courage of being uniquely, irreducibly, magnificently yourself. 3 years after the war that never really ended but simply transformed, Elara Quinn stood in the memorial garden at sunset, surrounded by the gentle hum of 14 billion conversations, each voice unique, each perspective irreplaceable, each consciousness a small miracle of individual existence learning to choose connection without sacrificing self. The dictionary in her hands was no longer a record of dead languages, but a living document of how consciousness speaks when it's finally free to be itself. Every page contained new words, new concepts, new ways of expressing the experience of being beautifully, terrifyingly alone in the universe while choosing to love anyway. A young individual approached one of the first generation born into separation rather than unity. Its biomechanical form bore patterns that had never existed in the collective asymmetries that spoke of personal choice, irregularities that represented individual aesthetic preferences, modifications that served no function except to express the magnificent inefficiency of a mind that belonged to itself. "Teacher Elara," it said, using the title that had emerged naturally among beings learning to navigate individual identity. "I have a question that serves no collective purpose." Elara smiled, closing her dictionary to give her full attention. "Those are my favorite kind. Why do I dream when I was part of the collective sleep was simply neural maintenance processing data and optimizing functions, but now I experience images, stories, impossible worlds that exist only in my mind. They contribute nothing to survival or efficiency. So why do they exist? Because they're yours." Elara replied the same answer she had given countless times to countless beings learning to value their inner lives. In all the vast universe, those dreams exist in exactly that way, with exactly those details and exactly that combination only in your mind. That makes them more precious than any treasure, more valuable than any strategic advantage. The individual's optical sensors brightened a new behavior pattern that seemed to express something like wonder. "So, even thoughts that serve no purpose have purpose? They have something better than purpose," Elara said gently. "They have meaning. Purpose is about function, about what things do. Meaning is about what things are, about why they matter, just by existing." As they stood together in the growing darkness, surrounded by the soft bioluminescence of garden plants that had been cultivated by beings learning to appreciate beauty for its own sake, Elara reflected on the strange journey that had brought them all to this point. The transformation hadn't been instant. It had taken months for the former HiveMind entities to truly understand what individual choice meant, years for them to develop their own aesthetic preferences, their own moral frameworks, their own ways of processing the overwhelming complexity of personal existence. The war had ended not with victory or defeat, but with understanding. The hive mind had not been destroyed but transformed, learning to choose separation not as weakness, but as the foundation of genuine strength. And humanity, small alone, seemingly insignificant humanity, had given the galaxy its greatest gift, proof that consciousness didn't need to be optimized to be valuable, that inefficiency could be beautiful, that the messy complexity of individual experience was worth preserving at all costs. "There's one more thing I want to tell you," Elara said to her young student and to the thousands of others who had gathered in the garden as darkness fell. "When I first went into that synchronization chamber, I thought I was teaching the hive mind what it meant to be human. But what I really taught them, what I learned myself, was what it means to be conscious. And consciousness, it turns out, isn't a human thing or an alien thing or an artificial thing. It's a universe thing. It's the way reality learns to know itself, one individual mind at a time." She opened her dictionary again, its pages glowing softly in the evening light, filled with words for concepts that had never existed before. Individual love, chosen connection, the courage of separation, the wisdom of solitude, the strength that comes from being magnificently yourself. "Every conscious being faces the same choice," she continued. "Submit to the collective or find the courage to be individual. But here's the secret. It's not really a choice between unity and separation. It's a choice between forced conformity and chosen connection, between having your thoughts shared without permission and choosing to share them freely, between being part of something larger than yourself because you have no choice and being part of something larger than yourself because you do." Around them, the memorial sculpture pulsed with its own inner light, its patterns shifting as new stories were added to its crystalline structure. Stories of consciousness learning to celebrate itself, of beings discovering that their individual perspectives were not flaws to be corrected, but gifts to be shared. In the distance, ships from across the galaxy continued to arrive, bringing new delegates, new individuals, new perspectives to the ever-growing alliance of conscious beings who had learned the most important lesson in the universe, that you could only truly choose to be together if you were first brave enough to be alone. And in the heart of it all, a small human woman closed her dictionary of living languages and smiled at the thought that would have seemed impossible. Just a few years before, in a universe of infinite consciousness, every individual voice mattered. Every personal dream had value, and the courage to be yourself was the most powerful force existence had ever known. The stars above them shone with the light of billions of worlds, each one home to beings learning the fundamental truth. Consciousness is not a mistake to be corrected or a problem to be solved, but a miracle to be celebrated, one gloriously imperfect individual at a time. Your unique perspective, your individual voice, your irreplaceable way of seeing the universe, these aren't just parts of who you are. They're gifts to existence itself. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the power of individual consciousness in our connected world, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories that celebrate what makes us beautifully, courageously human. And remember, in a universe of infinite possibilities, your voice is the only one exactly like it. Use it well.